I never know how to start these things, but I wrote notes, so I have a general idea of what I'm gonna say, as opposed to none, which is great for me.
Versus just silence.
Yeah, yeah,
A
yeah.
staring
Just
eye contest.
yeah, completely like pleading the fifth at the start of the interview. I might leave this in because I like when. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna start. Hey everyone, it's Matt here, back again, and well, back again because it's my channel, so I guess that's the precedent that I've set for this. But we are back here again, and we have a discussion that I'm very, 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 very excited to commence. We're talking with another creative paradigm and influence of mine, really, Emily Marsh. I'm very excited to be talking to her. She's an actress and puppeteer based out of Los Angeles. That's correct, right? You might be most well known as your role of Emily Connor in the most recent reincarnation of the cult comedy riffing series Mystery Science Theater 3000. But outside of this, she's appeared in many series and you performed in many a stage play. So you're quite the multi-hyphenate performer, I must say. Yeah, but today we're going to be talking a bit about Mystery Science Theater, but we're also just going to be going into acting, puppeteering, and sort of what it means to be a creative person in today's creepy world, you know, especially regarding creativity with things like AI. And I've talked a bunch about that, but I think it's pertinent for this conversation. But yeah, I'm super happy and grateful to be able to talk with her. And my first proper question is, how are things going where you are? You want to just give us the scoop?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so things are going good. You mentioned, I think, the creepy world of AI, and
Uh-huh.
it's kind of funny. Right now, I am still based in LA, but I'm actually spending some time with family in Vermont. And kind
Oh.
of that move was sort of precedented by, I'll be honest, kind of some weird times in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we went through two strikes in LA that were a really big deal. The actor strike, the writer strike. Um, I think the animators are on strike, or there was a lot of
Yep.
talk about that.
The Animators Guild is on strike, I believe.
Yeah,
Or
which I
was on
was
strike.
so yeah, which I was so glad I actually got to do a puppet project that was like a social media push for them.
Oh,
Which
cool.
was a really fun little sketch. But yeah, it was like, yes, stick it to the man. Here we go. Um, but I think it is one of those times where unfortunately those strikes happened, there was a slowdown of work, and I think everybody's expectation was kind of like things would come roaring back afterwards.
Hmm.
And it's not been as straightforward as that. So I would say times are definitely weird. Um, but you know, that's kind of what it's like being a creative, is like there are times where things are just going so well that you don't have time to sleep because you're so busy, and then
Uh-huh.
cut a hard change to, wow, things are pretty slow, and you got to kind of like keep up your strength. It's a marathon, not a race, and kind of have your eyes on the horizon of what the next thing is. And also when you start doing projects of your own, to fill the time. So
Yeah, I meant,
yeah, that's how I'm doing.
yeah,
Weird times.
yeah, I just meant, I was just checking on you personally because that's something I like to do. I find like a lot of interviews just go straight into the logistics, but we often forget about the humanity of it all, which is very important here at the Matthew Bianchini Enterprise.
Oh my gosh, Matthew. Well, if I'd known that, how am I? Oh my gosh, my mom's birthday was just a couple days ago. We went and
Oh,
got
happy
manicure
belated
pedicures
birthday.
together. Yeah, yeah. I have a puppy that's growing up
Aw,
fairly responsibly, not a menace to society. So
not
that's
yet.
always good. Not yet. That's true. There's still time.
Yeah,
Um,
so
but yeah,
great.
I don't know what that says about me that you asked how I was doing, and I was like, let me tell you about the industry, Matthew.
Well,
Probably
no,
means it's
well,
good I took a break in Vermont for a little bit.
no, because you actually that's actually really good because I talk about not exactly that, but I talk about things adjacent to that in like the later on questions. But speaking of the questions, before I get into my actual questions and we start our conversation, I guess I should sort of explain a little bit about how we began chatting. So I think in May I sent you an email a few months ago. I was watching a lot of MST3K, and I just wanted to tell you because I noticed you had a contact form on your website, and I just wanted to let you know like how much I enjoyed your episodes and the new episodes in general, and also your skill as a creative and a performer and a puppeteer. And to my surprise, you replied, and I remember I was like really elated. I was like, "That's awesome that she took her time out of the day to do that." And because this was around the time like that I started to host discussions with these interesting creative people on my channel, I decided to ask you if you wanted to be a part of one of my discussions. And I just want to say, like before we start, your approachability and your kindness in the face of my request was really, really appreciated and cool, and it's not lost on me. So before we start, I just want to say like thank you.
Oh, well, that's so sweet of you, Matthew. And honestly, it's my pleasure to, you know, for everybody that does send me an email and reaches out, like it really does mean so much to hear from people. And, as much as possible, I always love being like, hey, people who are fans of the show are the reason why I got to have it as my full-time job for like 2 years. So it's like, it's the least I
Hmm.
could do to give back and be like, oh my gosh, thank you for letting me have my dream job as being like a childhood fan of MST3K. And also just whenever people, with new things, whenever people reach out, I'm the most guilty of this, of sometimes being an angry nerd when what I love changes. And
Uh-huh.
so to then be a part of a show that I've loved since I was a kid as a new era of it, I always in my mind was like, oh man, I hope people who love this show don't reject the organ. You know what I mean? Like, hopefully I'm fitting in with what's come before. And so it's always just, I don't know. I'm a pessimist so that I always get surprised by people being happy that I'm a part of the show. So it always means so much when people reach out. So it truly meant a lot to get your email as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's totally my pleasure, and I'm super happy to be able to talk with you. So we'll actually let's get into the questions. So
Yeah,
I guess
absolutely.
yeah. So I guess my first official question, as opposed to my first unofficial question, um, is you. So I've read a couple of interviews where I think I've read one interview with you where you mentioned that you were like a pretty shy kid growing up, but that you found a sort of solace that was funneled like in performing for people. And I read this with like a lot of creative people and a lot of actors. So you found solace, like whether it be in like elementary school plays, or I'm assuming like homespun comedy bits that you would do for your friends and family. Am I correct in that?
Oh man, thankfully I grew up at a time where still, as a child, your homespun comedy bits were on VHSs that then could be conveniently lost by your parents or your friends and family, versus nowadays where those can just be uploaded on the internet and then you can never escape from what you did. So,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's some very, you know, embarrassing VHS tapes out there that thankfully will never see the light of day.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about there's a certain bristly malevolence to the internet being a forever archive that I'm not sure that I appreciate very much. I have some old videos. Let's not even get into it, but I
All right,
agree.
everybody, look up Matthew's old videos
You know
and
what?
report back.
I'll just put them in the description because it's already disseminated and out there. But I was wondering, like, can you like speak, if you can, like, to what precisely was drawing you into that medium as a naturally shy child, if you can pinpoint it?
Yeah, so I remember because the first time I ever did any kind of theater things was third grade in elementary school. And I was definitely a really quiet, shy kid. Like, definitely remember that feeling of, when you overthink what you should say
Uh
and
huh.
then you miss the moment of what you should say. It's like it's feeling out of step with everything around you, is how I
Hmm.
definitely felt as a shy kid. Um, just overthinking things too much, which led to you not saying anything at all. And so then auditioning for this like after school play activity thing that was happening at our school. And I remember somehow it was communicated to me that you don't need to be shy up on stage, which is kind of a crazy concept because usually people have the exact opposite reactions. It's like in life, you can be talkative and whatever, but then people get up on stage and then they get afraid of being in front of so many people. But I think for me, for some reason, that first time getting up on stage, I was like, oh, I'm untouchable now. I can be absolutely bonkers and crazy up here and nobody can stop me. This
Uh,
is like a permissible place. Um, and I think I remember even in that like after school activity that the person who was directing our little skits or whatever told me, they were like, you know, you're a really small little girl and you probably don't get to yell a lot in your everyday life. But in this sketch, I want you to yell as loud as you can.
that's
And I
great.
remember that being really liberating. So
Yeah,
I think ever since then it's just always felt like a safe arena, you know. It's like there's only that was a place that was actually more safe sometimes than talking with people in like normal day conversations.
yeah, I think that's because there must. I mean, I'm decidedly not an actor. I mean, I took a dramatics class in my senior year of high school, which I pretty much was not at all interested in. But through my perception of people who like to act, it seems that there's just because the stage is this sort of sandbox that is sort of it's there's sort of a veneer going on where different parameters and like different expectations are set. So it totally makes sense that like a naturally shy person would see the stage as an archway into extroversion and like totally cling on to that as like a sense of safety, you know?
Yeah, it's almost like you get permission,
Yep. Mhm.
which is interesting.
Yeah, they should do some studies relating to that.
Oh yeah. Well, and then you also just have straight up narcissists who like acting, who they're like, I love when everybody watches me. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh no, you're the dark side. You're the bad actors,
Yeah,
the
I
Sith
was go-
lords of actors.
yeah, totally. So, was this something that you just stumbled into independently, or were there any people that you like looked to in your like newfound sense of childhood extroversion who might have inadvertently made a path for like what you do creatively?
You know, I was really lucky and the my parents were always very supportive, but they and my dad was a musician. He played the French horn, not professionally, but that
Hmm.
was his passion. So they were always really supportive of the arts and me pursuing the arts. But what I always found really helpful and really supportive in my creative endeavors was that it just so happened that this little after school program that was at my elementary school, it was actually run by a lot of professional actors in the area in Washington D.C. And so from a very young age I got to be exposed to a lot of like working theater actor types,
Hmm.
which was great because they really were doing it for the love of it because in Washington D.C. there's no actors that are like $1 million theater actors in D.C. Like it truly is the theater energy there is of like, hey, we're doing this because we love it and we're scraping by and we're making it work.
Yeah.
And I feel like they really conveyed that to to all of us who are doing this activity, but it really made a big impact on me of like, no, this is what it's like to be a working actor. You know, it I think some people get into acting because they want to be, I don't know, famous or something. It's like when you have big superstars to look up to, it's kind of an unrealistic creative objective, I guess.
Hmm.
And I'm always really grateful that my my theatrical objectives were always like, oh my gosh, you know what'd be awesome is if I lived in a house with all of my friends and we just did theatrical productions every weekend out in the park or something.
Sort of like a
So
pseudo Little Rascals kind of situation.
basically, yeah, lovable underdogs of theater for sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that must have been like so liberating to have that tightly knit community of people who are getting up every day and they might be barely making it, but they're just doing it by the skin of their teeth because the passion supersedes any any nebulous objective of fame or wanting to be perceived on like that really wide, daunting scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And it prepared me for the times when things weren't going to be good.
Hmm.
Um, which I'm so grateful for because I think there's a lot of, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of ups and downs,
Hmm.
and it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I've definitely seen so many of my friends who we all started out in kind of the same place of pursuing this. And when hard times happened, it's very easy to get knocked down. And there is no shame at all in have it's things can be rough and saying like, hey, I'm out. I don't need to live this hard anymore. Um, but it was always good that from the beginning, I knew it was going to be a lot of fun, but my role models were also pretty honest with how it could be difficult. So that was good. It was good to know both of what you were going into.
Yeah, very very character building. From what you're telling me. So
Something like that.
yeah, yeah. So pivoting to like, so you're in elementary school and you get this newfound sense of liberation through acting and being exuberant on stage. Now, when you're making the transition from like elementary school, primary school to high school, I was wondering how was your high school experience? I mean, I've talked the last discussion I did, I mentioned that my high school experience was rightfully, it was terrible, because I think that it's I mean, there's a certain, I'll get into the question, but just to expound a little bit, there's a certain amount of,
Mhm.
there's kind of a cognitive thing of thinking like, oh no, we're past that 80s cliche of the jocks are here, the cliques are here, the nerds get shoved
Mhm.
in lockers. And it's like very easy to believe that because it seems so antiquated. But in
Mhm.
my experience, that was true in like a more insidious, subtle way. And it did not make for a good high school experience for me. I had a really bad time in high school, and that was tough. But it like I said, it was character building to circle back around. Um, so I was.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something?
Oh no. Well, I was gonna say that it was funny to be painfully shy in elementary school, and I was liberated on stage. But honestly, though, I really didn't get over my shyness in life with people
Uh
until
huh.
like freshman year of high school, basically. Like,
Hmm.
I was so into theater and doing stuff on stage, but it still meant that I was like a shy person in my life until, in high school, it's a little bit of a, sink or swim situation
Yeah.
where you're
Right.
like, for better or for worse. And basically, I had this moment where I was like, well, I only have one friend. And when
Hmm.
that one friend doesn't come to school, it's like the worst day in the world for me. And I was like, something's got to change. Like, I got to do something to make it through these next 4 years and have it not be totally terrible.
Hmm.
Um, and so that kind of started a journey of, I do think I changed a lot during high school. Not always for the best. I'm
Hmm.
very glad I'm not the person I was in high school. Thank goodness. Um, but it was interesting to kind of make the best of a bad situation.
Right.
And that was character building. And that was definitely a good lesson going forward. And it was really good that I had theater classes in high school. And it also kind of worked out that some of the most popular kids in school were into theater at my high school, which is bizarre and weird,
Hmm.
because that's not usually the norm. Uh, but that was the case.
I was gonna say, are you
And
like in like a core line situation of a high school where there are other jocks and other cool people?
I know, well, but isn't it so true in every high school? There's always some popular crowd. That is always the same. But what
Yep.
form they take is always unique to every high school. Like, I feel like our high school, it was like the lacrosse team. The boys' lacrosse team was like the coolest kids in school.
Hmm.
And I know that at other high schools, it's like football team, or like stereotypically, it's like the football team.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And for us, it was weirdly lacrosse, the girls' field hockey team, uh, there were popular kids in theater, which was very confusing. It didn't mean that I was popular. It just meant that I could see a closer view, of
Hmm.
what popular was in high school. Yeah. It's actually, I'm so glad that you're asking about this because I feel like it's such a revealing and like sensitive time that
Hmm.
I, as an adult, I mean, I'm, oh boy, I had to think about this. I'm 33.
Hmm.
So high school for me was over in 2009. So it's coming up on almost 15 years. I'm so
Hmm.
good at math. 15 years of being not in high school,
Hmm.
but still, even you asking me about it and being like, who were you in high school? And I'm like, oh no, that's my soft squishy center. We can't talk about that time.
Yeah.
That's a dark time where we did things to survive.
I think that it is important to this metastasis and this growth as a creative person, because in high school, I'll talk about myself for a second, but just in my experience, I was very, to be honest, I was pretty unpopular, and I knew people, but I never
Mhm,
felt like I had like an angle. Like, you know how like a rock band will have an angle, or they have this thing that's like so them. I never felt like I
mhm,
clinged onto any subsect or any subculture in the way that
mhm,
other people did. And when you're lost in that ether of high school, it is that ether of like unknowability and sort of insecurity with like where you fit in. It's like a really
mhm.
terrible, like insidious feeling. And I feel like, it's probably tempting to sort of, you can kind of look back at it and you can make fun of it, but I think that like recognizing that inner discomfort and that inner pain is actually pretty avenging in the long run.
Absolutely. And it goes to show that, like, you know, if you were to ask me, I'd be like, oh, high school, that was a long time ago.
Hmm.
But obviously, still so many years later, I remember all of the feelings and really big experiences that I had in high school that were like, you know, some good, some still lightly traumatizing to think back on.
Uh,
Um, it's just such a crazy time. It's such a weird time.
yeah.
Everybody's weird. Nobody, everybody's doing a weird thing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I think senior year of high school, when I think a friend of mine invited me to a party that was like a graduation party that somebody was hosting at like their family's house that was out of town or something like that, And it was
I was
over the summer.
getting real teen movie with it.
This was the most teen I got to be in high school, was getting invited to this party.
Right.
And we were there, and it was like the last party before everybody went to college. And this one girl was like, I'm going to miss these parties. These were my favorite part of the past 4 years in high school. And I was like, I had no idea these were happening the past
What
4 years.
what
This is the first
parties?
one I was invited to. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What do you mean we've been doing this for 4 years?
Yeah. I think that was like very analogous to like my experience, where I wasn't invited to one of those parties, and nor did I really want to. I was like doing my own weird thing, and I'm glad to still be doing my own weird thing in slightly more
Hmm.
mature and adult ways. But anyway, I was gonna ask, just, we're gonna put a bow on this high school question, but I was gonna
Hmm.
ask, how did your time doing theater in high school inform your vocation going into college? Did you know precisely what you wanted to do studying theater, or were things kind of still up in the air for you?
So things were pretty set for me. Like I was like, I definitely want to study theater in college. Um, I was really lucky that our theater teacher in high school was also somebody who was pretty she was pretty out there as a theater teacher. Like I don't, this is like one of those names that you never would know unless you went to college for acting. So it sounds so pretentious, but there's a theater teacher, Uda Hagen, and our high school teacher had been in classes with Uda Hagen, like Uda Hagen had been her teacher. And so it was all kinds of weird stuff like we do, where it was like walk into a room and visualize everything
Hmm.
and interact like we were doing it as realistic as possible. Like it was some weird Russian theater exercises we were doing.
Right.
So by the time I was done with theater in high school, I was like, no, 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 Matthew, I am an artiste.
Mm-hmm.
I am doing my art. Like I would actually say I probably was pretty obnoxious and pretty high on the smell of my own farts at the end of high school when it came to acting.
Yeah.
So that was the energy I definitely took into college. And thank goodness got pretty smacked down my first year. Thank goodness, because otherwise I would have been a terrible person. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's not really your fault though, because the way you're describing it, those classes you took is like this pseudo bohemian, like you're wearing a black turtleneck and you're playing bongos. It's like that level of pretension. I don't think that's a good
oh
environment
yeah, it's
for
like,
anybody with a predisposition for, like being on your high horse, especially in high school. Like that's such a common state for a lot of people and a natural progression. So,
oh yeah, oh yeah, and I feel like that's the classic stereotype of like an acting student in high school who's just like, I wrote this poem today. It's about how life is fleeting and how I don't even care anymore. And you're like
yeah.
that stereotype exists for a reason. And I've been there. Unfortunately, I've absolutely been there. Thank goodness also I didn't publish any poetry on Tumblr back in the day. Thank
Yeah.
goodness.
All of that poetry
That
was sub like your girlfriend's brother's emo band lyrics anyway. I think that's well within like lost to the internet ether. So
exactly. They're in composition notebooks that have been lost. Thank
uh
goodness.
marble
Thank
notebooks
goodness.
with every etching crossed out.
Oh my gosh, colored in with different colors.
Uh-huh.
Ugh, those were
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, so I want to talk to you a little bit about puppetry because so you're really into theater at this point. And just the curious thing with me is like with Mystery Science Theater, I've been watching it for 2 years straight. And the thing is, like, I didn't realize that the bots are technically, like, categorically puppets because they're not necessarily archetypally shaped as puppets. They don't have these oval features and they're just not. Oh, and like their personalities are so lifelike and sort of caustic and just not as frivolous as most performers make the puppets' personalities usually. So I never
Mhm.
registered that those are actually that the art of puppetry is imbued within Mystery Science Theater until really like pretty relatively recently. So I was
Mhm.
interested in how exactly did you get into puppetry. And I know that like I've actually watched a lot of interviews with a lot of puppeteers, and it seems like it's a pretty multifarious thing you get into. You either get into it because you're interested in it as a medium, or you're kind of thrown into it, or like some people are more into like the design aspect of it. What was your
Mhm.
background going into puppetry, and was it like an easy terrain to acclimate yourself in?
Yeah, and actually, before I get to that question, I love that you said that, Matthew, about the puppets with Crow and Tom and Gypsy
Mm-hmm.
in MST3K, because I felt the same way. Like I've watched Mystery Science Theater since I was a little kid with my dad. It was like our bonding experience. My dad, me, and my brother would watch it when my mom was out of town. And I agree. Like, I think somebody was asking, they're like, did you watch Mystery Science Theater and it got you into puppetry? And I'm like, I'll be completely honest. I didn't even think about them as puppets. Like, they were
Right.
just their characters.
Yeah, they were
Um,
just them. They were just there.
yeah, I was like, what do you mean they're puppets? No, they're characters. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So that's so funny you said that. I 1,000% agree. Um, so I would say my origin story with puppetry had to do with at the end of college when I'd been doing acting for 4 years and honestly had gotten kind of burnt out on the whole thing because we had just had an experience at the end of college of like going to meet casting directors in LA. And I remember one of the LA casting directors was like, oh, you guys don't even need to say a word, and I can tell you what you can play. And he just went around, he was like, you could play a cop, you couldn't play a cop, you could play a cop, maybe, no, yes, no. Like it
Mm-hmm.
was all just based on looks. And I remember I was like, this is so boring. Like what I can play based on what I look like is only like 1% of what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had done Avenue Q that year at college, which is a great show. It's fantastic.
Legendary
Um,
show.
it's a good one. It's a good one. But so being introduced to puppetry through that show, I was like, oh, this is awesome. You can be anything as long as you can do a voice for it or you have the right puppet for it. Like your range just expands so much.
Hmm.
So that was what led me to pursue auditioning as a puppeteer for a touring puppetry company that was out of Cincinnati, Ohio. And that was my first job coming out of college, was being a puppeteer for that company. And then that snowballed to be like, oh, well, you did puppeteering for this job. What about this job? That's a
Hmm.
puppetry job. And it just kind of one thing led to another. And that was back in 2013 when I started professionally puppeteering. So,
Oh, neat. And I'm sure, like, growing up as a kid, you had a lot of puppet media to fall back on, you know?
and it's so funny because my grandfather would take me and my everybody is always looking for like a sweet puppet origin story, you know. It's like, oh, you must have loved them when you were a kid, and many people have that story as puppeteers
Yeah.
that they're like, I was always enchanted by puppets or whatever. And I feel like I was just one of those kids who the Muppets and Sesame Street, I was like, they're not puppets, they're people, what are you talking about? And only
Yeah, the sort of
my
no
dad.
fun intellectualizing it. I was like that too when I was like 5 or 6 in Sesame Place. I was just like, That's not a puppet. That's a person behind that mask."
And you know what? This fits with my personality because now when I see magic as an adult, I feel like there's two personality types for people who go to see magic shows. And there's people
Hmm.
who are like, how'd you do that? Show me the trick. And I'm always like, don't tell me a word. I just want to believe it's magic. And I feel like that same thing was true for me when I was a kid with puppets. I'm like, don't tell me how it works. I want to
Hmm.
just pretend you're a real creature that's alive in our reality.
Uh-huh.
Um, except for my grandfather took us, me and my brother, to go see puppet shows at a local puppet theater. And that was terrifying. Also, watching Dark Crystal as a child, terrifying, though I loved it. So I feel like there was a lot of, you know, there was a lot of puppetry love and hate,
Mm.
and maybe a little bit of fear. And maybe it's still there. Maybe that's why it all worked out, you know? Like
Hmm.
you're afraid of how much you love them.
Well, I think that fear that you might have felt is sort of insidiously valuable because it is sort of showing you that you have two sides of the spectrum. You have puppetry, which is intended to enlighten and engenders a sense of security and comfort
Mhm.
within the children, like, Sesame Street and most of the Muppets. And then you have things like the Dark Crystal and, puppets that are just unintentionally creepy, that it kind of displays to you that this is such, like how you said, like you can only play a sliver of people as an actor. That multifarious nature of puppetry probably, it would have influenced me probably because it's showing you that there are so many sides of the spectrum.
It's very true. And I feel like Jim Henson always kind of suffered from the fact that everybody always loved Sesame Street and the Muppets, and they never
Hmm.
really wanted him to do anything else but that. Like, kind of to be this cuddly, happy go lucky puppetry thing. When I think it's so interesting that he was like, you know what's my passion project? Making a crazy fantasy film where I don't even want them to speak English. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
and puppets can be so terrifying. And I think that's
Hmm.
a testament to how effective they are when it as a performance medium, is
Hmm.
that like a creepy puppet can really stay with you for years and years and years because it's just so, I don't know, it's kind of like animation. Like scary animation can really stay with you for a long time
Right.
because it's so otherworldly
It's
and just can
uncanny.
have such a big impact. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's very evocative.
Uh-huh, exactly. And yeah, I totally agree with what you said. Although Jim Henson was like, I remember when I was 5 or 6, like in the school library, we had a book named Who is Jim Henson? This is a part of like this series where it, like little short kid centric biographies of people.
Hmm.
And I remember reading like the Jim Henson. I think I might have gotten like a bigger Jim Henson book, which was actually more in depth. And I remember
Hmm.
like I was weirdly very touched by like his spirit and his creations. Not even really having. I mean, I watched Sesame Street and like the Muppets as a kid, but like reading about his creations and how benevolent he was as a person and how just genius he was in creating in crafting a world like that definitely left like a really really big impression on me.
Also, such a really cool his the Center for Puppetry Arts, which I got to work at, they have an amazing museum about Jim Henson, and I love they show so much of his early work, his experimental work. Like he's such a great example of somebody who had success and then would keep experimenting. Like he
Hmm.
never ever was satisfied with being like, well, this is my shtick now, and like I
Yeah.
just crank out Sesame Street stuff and that's fine and I'll collect the dollars. It's like he always was thinking like, oh no, what's the new experiment? What's the new thing I can make creatively? And that is absolutely so inspiring. Like,
Yeah,
I
totally.
mean, it's crazy. He basically created like a new medium
Hmm.
and then wasn't satisfied with that. He was like, nope, let's keep doing more. You're like, my gosh, that's more than most people are able to achieve in a lifetime. And he did it like 3 times.
Yeah, I think most people would have been like very complacent, like, okay, we figured out the formula, let's stick to this. This makes me the most amount of money. Jim Henson, I think he was just such a creative, pure, like the creative process was so pure with him. He just wanted to keep expanding and getting better and better, and it felt like so natural to him. Um, so keeping on the
Mhm.
topic of puppets, I was gonna ask, so with your background in theater, what are the like the commonalities of puppeteering and play acting, and then sort of the inverse is like what might be some lesser known disparities between the two mediums, and did you have any difficulties adapting to the puppetry medium?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good question. I think I was very, excuse me. Um, I took to puppetry pretty naturally. I think because I always liked being a physical performer.
Hmm.
Um, and I liked, if there was anything that I probably always got feedback on as an actor, I think there was one time somebody was like, can you do that again, but make your face less crazy? And they're completely right. I mean, you know, I love being emotive. Obviously, if anybody watching this interview can see, it's like I love being emotive. And
That's not a bad
sometimes with
thing, though.
acting, it depends on the acting you're trying to do, because I
Right.
do know that when I'm faking it as an actor, I absolutely push it to be way too emotive.
Oh, okay.
Which
Yeah.
kind of kills me sometimes when I watch stuff. I'm like, oh, I know when I'm totally floundering and making stuff up because I'm just going way over the top.
Yeah.
But when it came to puppetry, it worked out well because I really love breaking things down into physical beats. So it
Hmm.
was like, hey, you got to pick up the cup, then walk over here, laugh, and walk off stage. And that's a lot of the direction you get for puppetry. It's like all very physical. Even a conversation about, hey, the puppet needs to look sad in this scene. How do we make the puppet look sad? Does it need to look
Hmm.
down? Does it need to like crumple up its jaw? Like it's a very physical conversation
Yeah, and must
versus
be
with
very
acting.
intuitive.
And it's at least it's very it's detached
Hmm.
from your ego a little bit. And I don't think I'm explaining this well, but just as an example, I always explain whenever like doing on camera stuff with puppetry and they're like, hey, the puppet didn't look sad enough in that scene. So, and I'm like, oh, cool. Well, maybe we can make some adjustments or like I can work with that. And then as an actor, if somebody is like, you didn't look sad enough in that scene, and you're like, oh, I thought I looked sad. Did I not look sad? And then that becomes like an ego thing where you're like, oh no, what am I
Uh-huh.
doing that's wrong that I don't look sad? And I love that puppetry is disconnected from that. It's like, oh no, it's a technical skill. If I haven't achieved what you want, I know a solution to fix that. And
Hmm.
it's much more practical and hands-on and more like more practical versus acting. It's so mental because if
Hmm.
somebody is like, you don't look sad enough in that scene, you're like, oh boy, I guess I should, think about my dog dying or something like that more.
Hmm.
Make it
Yeah,
seem like I'm sad. It's a little weirder.
yeah, like puppetry is not, it's not centric around your ego. Whereas if I imagine if somebody tells you that they give you criticism about your puppetry, you probably wouldn't take it straight to heart as you would like somebody critiquing you as a person by extension and like your physical form. So yeah, that makes like no, that makes total sense, like how you just explained it.
Mhm. And it's also nice to have like if and I have gotten critique on my puppetry skills sometimes, and sometimes it has hurt, but it's always nice
I'm
when
sorry.
you do get feedback. It's how you get stronger, Matthew. No,
It
I'm
made
just
me
kidding.
feel bad for a
Um,
second.
don't you worry. It's they were mean old men and they're fine. Uh, but getting feedback about puppetry skills, it's always nice that it's like, oh, your lip sync is a little off in that scene. And it's
Mhm.
like, oh, fantastic. I can go back, I can practice the lip sync and then come back. Like with puppetry skills, there always seems to be more of a practice, practice, practice. Here are the things I can practically do to then achieve that skill. Um, and that with acting is a little harder.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So yeah, so now I'm doing this chronologically, basically. If you follow the
Mhm.
schematic of this interview, just because it helps
I
me,
am. I liked your puppet hand there. We're following the schematic.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about Mystery Science Theater for a bit. I imagine this is what people will most want to hear about. So I actually did have I had 3 or 4 questions about Mystery Science Theater. And
Hmm.
so you've told the story about how you got the starring role as Emily Connor quite a few times
Hmm.
in your interviews. And so to ask a different question, I was doing some research and it says, I don't know if this is technically true because anybody can edit a wiki and the ethics of
So
that.
excited to hear what you're gonna say.
Well, no, it's not anything bad. It's not like deathly personal, but it's so was your first like your first involvement with Mystery Science Theater was supporting the bots as a set rigger during the Great Cheesy Movie Circus tour. Is that right?
Yes, and it was so
Oh, thank God.
funny. I know. What if you're like, if this? And I was like, that's highly personal, Matthew. I can't talk about that.
Yeah, just
No, it's
criminal
actually.
evidence right off the bat.
I just click it off. I'm like, well, we can't talk anymore. This interview is over.
Yeah.
Um, never speak of the movie rigger. No, it's actually so funny and a testament to Joel Hodgson being very similar to Jim Henson with having like an evolving creative process, which I absolutely love because the last thing you need to do as a creative is to double down on what your idea is. And I always loved that Joel was like, I had this idea and then I thought this one would be better. And maybe we'll try something else again.
Uh-huh.
And I think that was exactly what happened with when I first auditioned for the MST3K live tour. I first off was auditioning for GPC as a puppeteer.
Right.
And then they they called and they were like, "You're going to be playing Emily Crenshaw, the great cheesy movie circus rigger." Or
Mm.
I think that was what it was. Yeah, the rigger for the show.
And
And I remember
Crenshaw
I think
was
I
the
asked
tentative name, right?
Crenshaw was the tentative name. And I think I even remember asking, oh, I don't think I even had a name actually when they called. They were like, you're going to be the rigger of the great cheesy movie circus tour. And I went, well, what does that mean? What are you telling me that I'm doing? And they were like, we don't really know, but we'll let you know before like the first day of rehearsal. So going into it, all I knew was that I was the rigger. I didn't know my name. And I knew I wasn't a puppeteer, which is what I had auditioned for. So I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing with this, but
Hmm.
whatever. We'll see what happens. Um, so then I got there, and then my name was Emily Crenshaw. And in the beginning of the show, when we first started, I was helping with some of the gags in between the movie segments. And then at the end, it was teased Joel leaving, Joel escaping, and then me being the new host, which at the time I was just like, oh, I think it's just a motif of the show. I haven't been told anything. I don't know what any of this means. I'm living the dream. Whatever. They'll tell me eventually, whatever I'm
Uh,
supposed to be doing. And then as the show went on, was when Joel would sometimes be like, hey, Emily, do you want to like, I'll pretend to take a bathroom break and you can come in and like riff the movie for a little bit as me. And like that just sort of naturally happened over the course of the tour. But yeah, 1,000%. When it first started, I was like, I'm here to help the bots and move props and say a funny line. And then I would lie backstage for all of the movie segments and just watch them from backstage, which
oh,
was fantastic.
yeah.
I watched No Retreat, No Surrender so many times on that tour, and I would watch that movie again because it is fantastic. Circus of Horrors, less so. That's fine. That movie is fine.
Yeah, I mean, just I'm gonna get on with this question, but I just want to say
Yes, please.
the Munchie episode might take the cake for it's the most vicarious disgust that I felt at a movie watching the show. And by
Oh,
extension, it's like one of my favorite episodes that you guys have ever done. So
oh my gosh. And Jonah hates Munchie so much, which I'm sure everybody can tell from that
he's
episode.
awful. He's terrible. He's a terrible character.
Oh yeah. That's actually some like that's some method acting right there because everybody was suffering. Like everybody who wrote on that episode was suffering. Everybody who was in that episode was suffering. That was some true like deep hurting of MST3K.
Yeah. So the great cheesy movie circus tour. I was doing research and it ended in early March of 2020, which historically was right. I think it might have been like 4 days before the CDC was like, okay, the pandemic is like in full effect. Everybody is going to be on house arrest for a little while, and that turned into about a good 2 years or something. So did the pandemic impede any further plans with Mystery Science Theater in the live show, and how did it sort of affect your creative trajectory? Because I know around that time you guys started everybody creative sort of started scrambling for new and inventive ways to do comedy and to do creative work. So I was wondering, how did that affect the overall machine of Mystery Science Theater and by proxy your work?
Well, I think that around that time, that because of the pandemic, is why Joel decided to actually do a totally crowd-funded season of MST3K
Mm-hmm.
because we did the Moon Zero 2 live riff along as a pandemic special during that time, which was literally just out of the fact that everybody was hanging out at home from the live tour. And he
Mm-hmm.
was like, do you guys want to do this? Like, why not? And I feel like the interest in that event and the positive feedback from that event was kind of him. Like he just started to have the idea. He was like, wait a minute, like maybe we could make our own season.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the pandemic had a big impact on the trajectory of the next couple of years and sort of my journey with MST3K for season 13.
How about your puppetry? Were you doing, obviously you, well, I would assume like you're doing physical puppetry roles, and then how did that sort of mutate into like the new stasis where everybody is inside and having to take precautions? Did that like affect your process of like the medium at all? Because I could imagine it's like a pretty daunting task and just mired in so much uncertainty too.
Yeah, it was. I was super lucky during the pandemic as a creative because I had tour, like you said, had ended like 4 days before the lockdown. And so I had honestly already like made all of these preparations to be like, well, I had given up my apartment when I was on tour, so I was staying with my parents. And I was like, well, I'll wait to see what happens with this whole pandemic thing before I move back to New York and get a new apartment. That ended up being such a good thing because
Hmm.
I could just basically hang at home and lay low.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that was around the time when I was starting to get a real interest in. I had done on camera puppetry gigs before that, but that was the beginning of me being like, oh, I really want to do more on camera puppetry. And that lent itself perfectly to the pandemic because all you really need to practice with puppetry on camera, for the most part, is to have a monitor and a camera. And so during the pandemic, it was the perfect time to be like, well, I'm not doing anything else. Let me go into my room and just practice being on camera with a puppet and really trying to kind of get comfortable with that medium.
Hmm.
So, funnily enough, it all worked out pretty well.
A lot of self-taping during that period.
A lot of self taping, lots of weird ideas of what I thought would be funny. Like, definitely on tour, we found a monkey that looks just like the monkey from Merlin's, the Merlin episode of MST3K. If you've watched that one of
Hmm.
Mike's episodes.
Right.
Um, yeah, we found a demonic monkey that we thought looked just like the demonic monkey, like in the episode. And so I took that demonic monkey home with me. And during the pandemic, I thought it would be funny if we had matching outfits. So I definitely took a picture of me with a matching outfit with the monkey. And that was like probably my low moment of creativity during the pandemic. It was like, we've crossed a line. This is no longer, this is not for anybody anymore.
I mean, well, what can you really do? I mean, trying to come up with new comedy ideas in that dire of a situation, anybody would have to go back to the drawing board and sort of be like, okay, it's time to watch the 1930s silent film so we can really figure out what the ingredients are.
Oh my gosh. And thank goodness, at least, I didn't have to do the terrible experience that a lot of artists did during the pandemic, which is to do online Zoom comedy shows, which
Oh
there are
boy.
exceptions to the rule, but most of them, we can just admit, were bad. They were bad for people watching, they were bad for people in them. No one was having fun. So
Hmm.
I thankfully got to miss that one.
Yeah, and
Or
all the
Zoom
technical.
improv. Oh my gosh.
Right, all the
No way.
technical difficulty and like you can't quite tell what people are feeling, so you're like kind of astray and lost in the scene, and that would just make me totally scared.
It ducks the audio and you're like, sorry, what was that again? I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
Ugh.
No, it's all a part of your improv. You can lean on that as a crutch. Um
That's true. Just
yeah,
mute yourself.
exactly. So furthering the MST3K questions, I'm pretty interested in the writing process of it, especially nowadays, as well as the screening process, because I
Hmm.
was wondering, like, how is the delineation, if there's any delineation, made between who writes on a certain episode versus who does the movie watching and the screening, or if they're
Hmm.
concurrent, and what jokes are ultimately included for the final riffage. Is it like a lot of sort of pouring over jokes that have been written and, kind of like a process of elimination? Is it like a really stringent thing, or is it more like kind of a fly by the seat of your pants, more casual affair?
Actually, what I would say is it's sort of a combination of both. Because there were the writers' rooms where everybody would be kind of pitching jokes for every moment of a movie. So it would be going through like 30 seconds of the movie and then being like, okay, does anybody have pitches for this portion of the movie? And we just go through it like that, basically kind of 15 minutes at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So you could probably get through an entire movie in 2 weeks. So it was really taking our time going through it. And what I always liked about the writing process, and it was a very gentle writing process to be introduced to because I'd never written on a show before,
Mm-hmm.
um, was everybody threw in their ideas. Everything went into kind of a giant document documenting everybody's ideas for those moments so that then the final selection could be made by a different group of people who would then be able to kind of read through. And actually, Joel was big on not having people's names by who wrote the riff, which I think is really great because it takes the ego out of it, of being like, oh, my joke got picked.
And the implicit bias that might be rampant in a process like that.
Totally. It's like, it was just about what riff made the most sense where. So it was kind of like we were creating this gigantic option book of different jokes and moments for the riff. And so that was the first pass. And then the second pass was going through and seeing, well, what works best together in the final selection.
Right. So you mentioned like the movie being viewed in this sort of patchwork, kind of like fragmented, kind of like, stop the movie, let's conceptualize a joke, write it down, see if it gels. How often is a movie viewed in total, and what's the threshold to movies that are rejected as being riffable, and what's the quotient between like the rejected films and like the films that are, make for good riffing material?
Oh boy, that thankfully is a job that I never had to have, because that is truly like living the reality of MST3K, which was mostly done by Joel's Alterniversal's one of their producers, Matt McGinnis, who he and Joel together would basically view all of these movies to see
Rough.
which one would be a. Oh my gosh, yeah, what they described, like, basically sometimes Matt would say it's like, because you're really going into movies that, they pick out the diamonds in the rough for sure. But like for every good movie, there's probably like 20 bad movies that they had to go through. And some movies do get recommended by people. But then there's also the consideration of who owns the movie. Because MST3K has run into that a couple times where they're like, oh my gosh, this movie is perfect. I wish I could remember. For our second live tour, there was a movie we were supposed to do. And then it turned out Paramount owned it, and they wouldn't let us screen it without paying a ton of money. It was a terrible RoboCop like ripoff movie. It was like Death
a ripoff
Robot
on Paramount.
A ripoff on RoboCop.
Oh, that is actually really odd, because a lot of the movies that you guys are riffing are like these sub-trauma publications, but to have Paramount, that's totally strange.
Well, what had happened was it had been a small made movie like back in the 80s, but then it had just been sold to Paramount, because there's always this weird like behind the scenes selling of movie rights that's always been kind of confusing to me. But I thankfully, again, didn't have to do any of this not fun stuff. That was always being like, poor Matt McGinnis, who has to be like calling up the directors or creators of these movies and explaining to them that we are MST3K and we'd like to make fun of their movie,
Yeah.
And people's reactions to that. So that was definitely a very involved process that took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I luckily didn't have to be involved. That's what I would say.
Yeah, you got very lucky. I mean, us Matts, we always have to do the drudgery and everything that we do, which is
absolutely.
I'm really lamenting that right now. So were you writing on the movie circus tour and the actual, like, when you're on the show, are you writing some of your own riffs, or are they given to you by the actual writers?
You know what's so funny? There were some episodes where I did write on the episodes that I riffed on. My favorite example was Beyond Atlantis, which of course was just the first episode that I did. So it's always kind of got a squishy, soft place in my heart. But it was also, I wrote on that show, but the distance, like time distance between when we wrote on that episode and when we filmed it, I had completely forgotten what riffs I wrote. Like when we finally got to performing it, I was like, statistically, I must have said at least one of the riffs that I wrote, but I honestly could not remember.
Yeah.
Which is honestly, it's a good way to be, because
Yeah.
and again, it's a good way to let go of the ego, you know?
Yeah, you're living your well, you don't even know if they're your riffs, but without having that context, you're able to deliver the line completely devoid of any, like, I'm gonna give this line a little extra oomph because I'm really proud of
Right.
it. You know what I mean?
Right. I remembered this was my line, so I'm gonna really make sure to punch it through. Yeah, absolutely. It's like
Yeah.
so much time passed, and there had been so much writing in between then and when we filmed it that yeah, I didn't remember at all what I wrote.
Yeah. So we're getting up to my last question, kind of, but I was gonna say, for me personally, I find that the key to a great mystery science theater episode is a sort of yeah, you're excited.
I
for
love
this.
hearing when people say that. I'm always like, I love hearing what people love about what they think makes a good MST3K episode.
Well, I don't know if my views are unique or if they're pedestrian, but I will say that I think the key formula to a great mystery science theater film skewering is this sort of dumbfoundedness and awe at the spectacle of how incompetent the movie is, but also coupled with a sort of good-natured frivolousness that is inadvertently like showing respect for the effort that the movie, the directors and the actors went through in the creative process. Because you have to remember that even though, yes, these movies are incredibly kitschy and cheesy and incompetent, most of the people making the films are like pure of heart and are just passionate about, cinema, and they want to make a good film. And there is something, to me, that's inherently respectable in that. And I think that you can have your cake and eat it too, where you can be cognizant of, the respect and of the medium, and then you could also be like, okay, we can kind of rib this a little bit. It's cheesy, it's a laugh. So that to me is what makes a good mystery science theater episode. So I'm gonna ask two questions. One is, would you agree with the sentiment that MST3K, that there's really like no true malice in what any of you guys are doing? Because I've read quite a few articles that make it out to be like there's like you're out to take out all the bad directors, and you're skewering every terrible movie. I've never seen it that way, really. And my second question is, could you kind of speak, like, what do you think of the rise of like purposefully incompetent movies like Sharknado, and why they wouldn't make great viewing material for what you guys are trying to do?
Yes, and actually, I'm glad you brought up the Sharknado era of bad movies, because that really started to become a thing when I was in college. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that second question. But the first thing, I completely agree. And I actually don't think that's a pedestrian take at all. I think it absolutely is the spirit of MS23K that it's, and I know this is true in my own life as somebody who, I didn't even realize the big effect that MST3K had on my life, but that I always was such a fan of bad movies. It's like one of my favorite memories was all of me and my friends in college watching The Room, which I feel like is our generation's like epic bad movie that everybody loves.
Yeah.
And I've definitely had people who are like, why do you love watching this movie? It's so bad. And I'm like, I know, but I can't look like, it is a love thing. Like, I have had, there's some bad movies that I just come back to so many times. And it's not because I'm just sitting there being like, wow, what a stupid movie. I can't believe they did this. It's like, I think I love it so much because it's so bad and so earnest. Like, that's just, I agree. I think that's such an important element of MST3K, where it's like, these movies are bad, but we love them so much. Like, no retreat, no surrender.
Or otherwise you wouldn't be spending all this time analyzing each and every frame and coming up with these incredibly brilliant, clever jokes for them, which I think that's something that a lot of people not miss, but I think that's a more important aspect of the show, is like, there is love. There's no hate or negative animus to what you guys are doing, except maybe Munchie. That might be an instance of vitriolic hatred.
Oh my gosh. Well, actually, that's funny because I was just thinking that. And also on tour, the second time we went on the live tour, we were watching the movie Making Contact, which is, I do have a fascination with Making Contact. It is a very good, bad movie. I mean, it's so crazy. It's one of Roland Emmerich's like first films, and it's so bonkers. Highly recommend people watch it. But I do remember at the end of that movie, I was like, woof, I don't need to watch this movie again for a very, very long time. And so I love that it's almost like you start having these like relationships with the bad movies of MST3K. Like it's almost like having different relationships in life where you're like, oh, Beyond Atlantis. Oh, I loved it for these reasons. And Munchie, you're like, oh, that one is so bad. And I love it because it causes Jonah so much anger and disgust.
Right.
Like you're almost loving how awful it is. But the love of it is always there. Even for a movie like Munchie, there's still love.
Gotta have love for Don DeLuise.
Deep down there.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah,
but that puppet.
So, yeah, I and the bit where he, what's the bit? I'm beginning to derail this for a second, but I have to talk about this. In the movie Munchie, so the kid is like in school, and Munchie is like this kind of like bewitching figure. Like he just pops in and out like an angel of some sort. And he's in this
more
high
like
school.
A devil of some sort.
Yeah, so he's in this high school, and he's like, "Where are the cheerleaders?" And that made me do the most, like, this is terrible groan. I was like, "What the hell are the writers thinking?"
I was just thinking that it's just like an audible, just like, ugh, why?
I think that's what they do in the episode. They go, "Ew," like all in unison.
There's so much. All the pizza in that movie too. Like pizza has never looked more terrible than in Munchie. Just like so unappetizing. Everything's unappetizing in that movie.
Yeah, the presence of anchovies on pizza has never been more implied than it has in Munchie. But
too true.
Yeah. So like going back to the Sharknado thing, there was this little eruption in pop culture where you had these movies that are like kind of winking at the audience, and they're knowingly bad. But I'd imagine like you come across like a fair share of those when doing the screenings for MST3K, and they just don't work because that earnesty is not there. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's what I would say. And even I feel that same way with, I've already outed myself as being that friend that's like, guys, we could watch a good movie or we could watch a bad movie. Like, why don't we watch a bad movie? And I feel like there's been some times where sometimes I just can't get over the feeling like sometimes I'm being tricked when I watch movies like that.
Right.
Like when a movie is trying to be bad, it just somehow takes away. And I wish I had a better way to express why it feels like being tricked or why it just doesn't feel as engaging when something's like purposefully bad, like Sharknado, or even trying to think of something else in that same arena. Some of the Hallmark movies, I would say that I do love a So Bad It's Good Hallmark movie, but nowadays there's like a fine line between, I'm like, are you just trying to give me it's like a sugared up version of it. It's like it feels like it's cheating. Like no matter what, I want something earnest. And if the whole time it's sort of winking at itself, it just feels like there's nothing to, I don't know. I don't find them very satisfying, but I'm glad that other people do.
Yeah, I don't as well. And I think it's just that it's just sort of, it's more interesting to me to watch a bad movie made by a person with the time and the passion and the drive to actually earnestly try to make a movie than to watch a movie that is bad on purpose and you know that it's bad on purpose. It doesn't give me that sense of satisfaction personally.
And it's such a fine line. I feel like this is where you really can have a nuanced discussion, because I do think those movies like Sharknado that are trying to be bad are very close to camp, which I like camp movies.
Exactly.
But there's a difference there, which it's kind of hard to put your finger on it. So
Yeah, I think it just comes down to the intent, basically. Yeah, but I'm glad
yeah.
that we talked a little bit about that. I don't see many people talking about that in relation to MST3K, but I'd imagine that that discussion comes up quite a lot. Like, is this worth skewering if we know the people making it are their motives are not particularly pure? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a bit of a fine line too, because in season 12 on Netflix, the second Netflix season, they did oh my gosh, now I always overthink it. Atlantic Rim,
hmm
which I don't know if you watched that episode, but
That's a great one.
it's a really good one. But that production company, I remember also in college seeing all of those movies, and they were just making those movies to try and trick people into grabbing the wrong one off of like a Blockbuster shelf. Like
Yeah,
you just
yeah.
wouldn't look closely enough and you'd get Atlantic Rim, or you'd get Titanic 2 instead of Titanic.
hmm
And they were watchable.
hmm
I watched a lot of them,
hmm
but they were getting right there on the edge where
hmm
you could tell they weren't quite taking it seriously.
hmm
And then, of course, the other extreme of that is The Room, which is the most earnest movie I have ever seen in my life. And man, oh man, is that movie bad. And it's incredible.
Yeah, you might be into. I don't know if you watched this channel. Do you know Red Letter Media?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But I haven't watched their channel.
Yeah, well, they there was this video that they did where they describing exactly this, where it's like they're not gonna go through the time and effort of critiquing a purposefully bad movie because the intent isn't there, and that's actually why I asked this question, because I was like,
Yeah.
what enterprise is solely predicated on bad movies? Mystery Science Theater. So I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
interesting, and you bring up like a really good point about the kitsch and the camp of it all. But anywho, this is my like last technical question.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another humor related question. I thought it'd be a good like note to send things out on. Uh, Personally, I see Mystery Science Theater as kind of one of the last remaining tenets of generally like good natured humor in the mainstream anyway. Like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
there's very little off color jokes, there's barely any profanity, there's no punching down really at all, and it's
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's sort of an unspoken emphasis because of the wide swath of people who enjoy it, that it has to be a familial show. Not that I think it would punch down to a place like that anyway. I think that humor is too shrewd and too intelligent for that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it sort of feels like, so I'm 18. I'm a teenager, so I see a lot of teenagers. Their comedic sensibilities are this sort of uh awful, kind of unfunny, problematic, you know, blue humor. It's the kind of thing where people, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's the under the guise of dark humor, but it's really just in order to say a bunch of terribly offensive things and hope that they're funny, which they never are. But I got to thinking about this, is so MST3K has this good natured sense of humor. Do you think that in a world where mainstream comedy might be erring toward that sensibility, do you think it's true that comedy is only successful if it has that generosity of spirit and it's like egalitarian in its treatment?
What I would say is I think it's a little similar to, I think when art has constraints and when comedy has constraints, that out of those constraints can come really interesting, funny things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when it comes to more crude humor and things like that, you kind of have so much on the table all of a
Mhm.
sudden. Like nothing is forbidden, basically. Um, I think South Park South Park continually, and I'm a really big fan of South Park.
Mhm.
But South Park, nothing is off the table. And they really enjoy the fact that nothing is off the table. But they can pull it off because their humor, along with being so crude, they have so many intelligent and witty things to say along
Yeah.
with that.
Mhm.
And they play with the medium so well. And there's so many other people who try doing crude humor. And when it's not funny, it's just so bad. It's
It's
just like,
appallingly
so
unfunny.
it's like, oh boy, this is really terrible.
Mhm.
Um, there was actually, when growing up, there was a comedy sports near my high school that we would go to sometimes, like, because of course I was a theater kid. So we did the improv team. And I remember that they had like a family show for improv, and then they had a blue show later that was for like not for kids and more was mature, cruder humor.
Uh-huh.
And I remember thinking a lot of the time that I was like, actually the family show is funnier because you have to be more creative to find ways around the
Exactly.
quick joke. um it's like somebody was saying with puppets, how sometimes the first thing everybody does with puppets is to do something crude or to be like, oh, look, isn't this funny? And that's usually like, ha ha ha. Okay, now we've gotten that out of our system. Let's actually try doing some other stuff. And
Mhm.
usually that other stuff is a lot more creative and a lot more interesting
Mhm.
and isn't the first thing you go to. Like, just sometimes crude humor can just be the lowest denominator and
Mhm.
doesn't take that much thought or creativity.
Mhm.
I mean, it's sort of the equivalent of like in elementary school, that kid who would just yell out, be like, poop, and
Uh,
everybody would laugh. But there's nothing that's not memorable or creative or original comedy. It's sort
yeah.
of like many people have said this before.
Mhm.
And yeah, personally, I think being in the writer's room and knowing that definitely people tried to push the line with more darker jokes. And Joel would always do that thing. He's like, all right, I'll give you this one. And he's like,
Uh-huh.
no, that's too far. We got to bring it back, come up with something else.
Gotta
And
reel it in.
sometimes, and sometimes in those moments of reeling it back in is when you'd actually come up with a riff that was funnier than the original cruder idea for it, because the restrictions made you have to be more creative to
Mhm.
get over your original intent for the joke.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating insight because I'd agree that, the sort of knee-jerk impulse of a lot of people when they're trying to be funny, if you're even interested in, if you're on all the time and that's your personality, you probably have that knee-jerk kind of impulse just embedded within you more than the average person. But I think like a
Mhm.
lot of the time it is so easy to go for the crude joke and sort of the lowest common denominator. To come up with something that is substantive and witty and thoughtful in its comedy is much rarer
Mhm.
and it's has much more longevity in the scheme of being funny. So I just want to say, like, in a world where that might be the norm, I very much appreciate what shows like Mystery Science Theater are doing, because it shows that you don't have to resort to crude kind of politics and punching down to be legitimately funny and inventive with your comedy.
Mhm. No, I would definitely agree. It makes you a little more creative. Makes you have to
Exactly.
think about it a little bit more. But also, I was raised on British comedy. So for me, I'm like, ooh, witty repertoire. I love that in a comedy special. So, and
Yeah.
I know a lot of people that's not their bag, but
Oh, I mean,
that's why I
I'm still moved by all the British comedy that I watched growing up, like Black Book and Faulty Towers and these shows. And have you ever seen
Oh,
have you ever
even
seen
though Faulty Towers, let's be honest, so much of it was just yelling, but gosh, it was so funny. It's so good. I definitely grew up on Faulty Towers. I'm getting back because I have to plug in my computer because otherwise it will die. But continue talking about British comedy. I'm listening.
Okay, well, so like you're talking about British comedy, and the Brits have that sensibility of, like it's sort of innately prim, and it's kind of like aristocratic. Even if the actual subject of the joke is sort of inane, like it'll just have this air
Mm-hmm.
of like, oh, this is serious. We're treating this seriously, and I just think that like that those shows and also the just innate absurdity of British humor is like a big part of like my comedic sensibility. So it's cool that we have that reciprocal connection.
I 100% agree. Wait, have you seen Red Dwarf?
No, I have not. What is that?
I highly recommend it. It's a British comedy show from like the 90s, and they're making fun of all sci-fi shows. But
Mm-hmm.
it's really funny. So highly recommend. Definitely in like the same, there's a Venn diagram of Red Dwarf fans and Mystery Science Theater fans. And yeah, there's definitely some overlap there.
Definitely, I'll be sure to check it out. And you need to, if you haven't heard of it, check out Peep Show, which I think is one of the best sitcoms ever made, and it's British.
Yep. Oh yeah. I've seen some Peep Show. I need to see more of it. Thank you for reminding me.
Peep Show is absolutely incredible. It's like a British It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But anyway, so this
Speaking of crude shows, which
yeah,
I
yeah.
love.
Yeah, exactly. That's offensive humor done right, though, because we won't
There's
get into
always
this can of worms.
I know. There's more to be said. More to be said.
Exactly. But so yeah, this has been a really great discussion. I feel like we've gone down so many avenues and touched on so much. But I was wondering if you want to send off the viewers on, what is next for you creatively. It's sort of a cliche interview question, but I'm legitimately curious because you're involved with so many fascinating creative projects. And, if you wouldn't mind, tell us about where we can find you and just plug all your things so we can get out there and support your work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's some things on the horizon that are, as with most things in the creative industry, I'm like, there's some good things coming, but of course we'll see if they happen.
Mm-hmm.
But very excited about a couple projects that are coming up. I just got to get done filming a puppetry character on season 2 of Albie's Elevator, which is a adorable WHYY public access show for kids, but it's one of
Mm-hmm.
those kids shows where you, as an adult watching it, you're like, this is just amazing. This is legitimately entertaining for adults and kids. And
Mm-hmm.
the production company that makes it, they're so great. It's just like a ragtag group that makes such good work from Philadelphia. The creator, like just so much heart and soul went into this TV show. And on top of everything else, it's totally free for anybody to watch on YouTube. So
Mm-hmm.
it was great. They had season 1 got well received and won an Emmy, a Mid-Atlantic Emmy or something like that. One of those weird, like small niches, but
Mm-hmm.
they still won an Emmy, man. They still got that statue.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, so they just finished filming season 2, which will come out hopefully in a year or so. But the whole first season is on YouTube and it's so much fun. So
Mm-hmm.
highly recommend if people want to check that out. And then of course, you know, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok as I basically entertain myself with my weird media obsessions and then
Mm-hmm.
puppetry challenges that I'm working on. So it's always nice to get feedback from people about those things. And it definitely keeps me sane in between doing creative projects and just kind of, getting to share with people what's on my mind. So
Yeah, no, when I had like proper Instagram and everything, I very much enjoyed confusing my very small audience. There's a sort of joy in that, just posting the most bizarre thing and then everyone kind of has to be complacent, go along with it. Like, okay, this is what somebody thought of that day. But
it's very true. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, I really had like a really great time, and I just wanted to thank you a lot for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it. I thought this was great, and when I upload this, I'll definitely send it to you if you want to, tell people that you've had this chat, which I hope that you've enjoyed as much as I have. I thought it was very, very amazing. So just please have a good night, and I hope that we can talk again soon. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too, Matthew. You asked so many questions that I've never gotten asked before, which is awesome. Not that
Hmm.
I'm always happy to talk about the stuff I've already talked about, but it's always nice to get new new stuff to discuss. So, thank you so much for all of your questions. They were awesome.
Oh, thank you. Very cool. I'm glad that we got some that new perspective. So yeah, thank you very much, and be sure to check out Emily on all of her social media, and keep a keen eye out because she is very talented and a multi hyphenate, and really somebody that I really admire. So thank you so much for being on the channel.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew.
All right, thanks. See ya.